When I was a kid, I watched a lot of TV. Hell, I watched it so much my parents didn't let me keep one in my room. They correctly thought I'd stay up all night watching cartoons or weird sci-fi movies. Then Katrina hit New Orleans. We got out safe, but our house was in such bad shape, we had to move into an apartment miles away from all of my friends. My folks felt bad about the situation, so they set up a 9-inch set on my desk and made me promise to go to bed on time. That promise was swiftly broken. The TV had a headphone jack, and I managed to score a compatible set by trading some kid at school a Blue Eyes White Dragon. As long as I wasn't too loud, I was free to watch whatever, whenever. Those days were rough, so it was nice having something I could lean on when I started missing home. One Saturday night, I was flipping through like usual when a bumper I'd never seen before caught my attention. The bumper faded in on an image of a clown dressed entirely in black, sitting on a stool in the middle of an empty white room. I know what you're probably picturing, but she wasn't scary at all. In fact, there was something inviting about her. Curious, I put down the remote and settled in to see what would happen. The clown pulled out a pocket watch and showed it to the camera. The second the hand hit 11 o'clock, the tip of her mouth ticked up into a gentle smirk. She put the watch away and said, "It's 11 o'clock, kiddies. You should be in bed, but since you're not, welcome to the Crossing Hour. We have some new viewers tuning in tonight, so let me give you a quick rundown." She looked around and motioned for the camera to come closer. The camera zoomed in until the clown's face filled the screen. I noticed her irises were yellow. She winked, and I blushed. I felt like I'd been caught doing something embarrassing. "I'm your host, Reagan Sorrows," the clown said. "Here's how this works. 11 to midnight, everything's spooky fun and games. Midnight to 1, we cross over to something much, much scarier. Younger viewers should probably switch off once we shift to the black room. That means you, hun." The camera pulled out just enough to catch Reagan pointing at the screen. I knew it was silly, but it felt like the comment was aimed directly at me. Naturally, I was hooked. After catching that first broadcast, I watched Crossing Hour every Saturday night without fail. Every week, the programming changed, and you never got the same combination of shows 2 weeks in a row. I didn't know about variety shows or stuff like The Wonderful World of Disney at the time. So, the idea of never knowing what I was going to get was a real thrill. The block always started with the White Room shows. None of Crossing Hour's programming had age ratings, but the White Room seemed to be more or less for all ages. I can't remember everything I watched on it, but a few stand out. Almost every week, there was a new episode of Heckbusters. It was like X-Files for kids, but with a higher budget than shows like Goosebumps. Every episode followed a different team of kids as they investigated some spooky happening around the world. Some of the teams were used multiple times, some just once. The through line was that they were all members of Heckbusters International, a sort of boy-girl scouts for monster hunters. My favorite kid was David. He was a loner, but he was really smart and knew a lot about how to trap ghosts and fight werewolves and stuff. Even better, We had the same name, so I could pretend I was the one fighting monsters and helping out my friends. His group got the most episodes, which I was always really happy about. Grim Grimm's Palace was a puppet show about the Grim Reaper. I want to say it was a parody of little kids' shows like Bear in the Big Blue House, but there was something weirdly sincere about it. Grim, as the Reaper insisted the audience call him, was trying his best to be one of those cool uncle types for the viewer. The catch was his palace was full of demons and weird creatures that annoyed the hell out of him. So most of the time he'd end up getting angry, and the episode's intended plot would go out the window. There was always a moral, but it was presented so poorly, I usually ignored it and laughed at the shenanigans Grim got into. Not going to lie though, a couple of the lessons landed. I still think about the conflict de-escalation episode, since it's the one time Grim managed to keep his cool. Stopped clocks, I guess. The timing was a cartoon that's hard to describe. Every episode features a giant humanoid statue that occasionally, quote, plonks into a different time period. A crowd would gather around the statue and debate what it was before the statue stood up and started to walk around. What followed was usually some sort of trippy chase scene involving the statue transporting people through time and space on a whim. At the time, I couldn't wrap my head around it. I think if I watched it now, I'd like it more. Some of the visuals were pretty out there. Tony's Rat Time Kitchen only ran once. As you might expect, it was a cooking show starring a giant rat named Tony. It played out like a regular cooking show, but all of the ingredients were moldy and rotten. There wasn't any music, and it didn't seem like Tony had an audience. But he kept acting like he did for some reason. It didn't help that Tony was kind of disturbing. The way he moved wasn't right. He was too fluid to be a puppet. But the proportions were so stretched out, he couldn't have been a guy in a suit either. His eyes were constantly moving too, never settling on one thing. He was so manic. It was like he was drugged or something. At the end of the program, Tony took a bite out of his nasty-looking pizza, moaned with pleasure, and said he'd get me to try his food one day. It was so creepy. Reagan actually apologized for it the week after it aired. That bastard rat has starred in many of my nightmares. Still can't watch cooking shows because of him. Lally's Funhouse was weird because it seemed out of place on a midnight block. It was a kids' show about these three bulbous mascots named Lally, Lule, and Lo that bounced around and learned how to share or whatever. I was a bit too old for it, but it was nice background noise while I caught up on comics or doodled. Every episode, the mascots sat down and told the viewer how much they cared about them and how great a friend they were. For some reason, I always caught myself saying it back. A dumb show, but charming. Saving the best for last, my favorite show was Raguel, Radiant Retribution. The concept was this angelic robot superhero guy rescued kids in trouble by beating the shit out of demons. Think Bible Man, but replace the title character with the Doomslayer and make the villains actual threats. Nostalgia could be coloring my perception, but the special effects were some of the best I've ever seen. Lots of massive puppets and intricate suits that looked so good. I swore the monsters were real. For some reason, they didn't play it much. If I had to guess, it was probably because it was way too expensive to run it every week. The one weird thing about it was every episode would end with Raguel talking to the viewer about how to protect themselves during spiritual warfare. Always pray before bed. Don't make deals with ghosts even if they seem friendly. Use salt to deter spirits, etc. It wasn't bad advice, necessarily. Just seemed a bit esoteric for a kids' show. I still think about this one. Wish I could find it online. One of the best things about the block was there were never any commercials. Instead, Reagan would talk to the viewer between the shows. If Mr. Rogers was your lovable grandpa, Reagan was your cool aunt who'd let you watch R-rated movies and sneak you a sip of her beer. She told a lot of funny stories, and occasionally read viewers' letters. I tried writing to her once, but I couldn't send it because for some reason they never showed a mailing address. I guess in hindsight, the letters could have been fake, but I like to believe they were real. I'd usually turn off the TV and go to bed when the White Room programming was over, but occasionally I'd stay up to see what happened in the Black Room. When the White Room shows ended, Reagan would say goodnight to the kids watching, wait a moment, and snap her fingers. The color would then bleed out of her clothes and into the room, staining it an unnaturally dark black. Reagan, now dressed in white, would then introduce the night's programs. Even as a child, the symbolism was about as subtle as a brick to the face, but it was a cool effect. When Reagan was in the Black Room, her personality shifted. She was still playful, but in a more bitter way. She never crossed over into being a jerk, but she'd tease the viewer for watching such horrifying content and taunt people who were trying to record the block. I never figured out how to tape shows for later, so I'm not sure if it was actually possible to tape Crossing Hour or not. That said, her stories of television sets catching fire turned me off trying anything. I didn't watch the Black Room very often because most of the shows were too freaky for me. That said, I recall the ones I caught in my braver moment. Stola's Round Table was a recurring segment that played every couple of weeks. They'd usually show it first, so it was the Black Room show I caught the most. In it, a man wearing a suit, gloves, and an owl mask sat in the middle of a nicely decorated study and talked about current events, news stories, science, that kind of thing. He had a chair, but for some reason, he was always sitting in the middle of a white circle. Usually, he was alone, but sometimes he invited guests on. All of his guests also wore animal masks and sat in white circles. I thought his show was boring most of the time, but I liked what he did whenever a guest said something he didn't agree with. He'd always cut them off by saying the word drivel in a low voice. Stolas would let the silence sink in for a moment, then he'd continue on as if nothing had happened. Guests almost always kept their answers to a short yes or no after that. In retrospect, most of Stolas's guests seemed to be afraid of him. Pretty creepy setup for what ultimately amounted to a talk show. Cletus Cunningham's chain Boree was shot in what appeared to be a flooded basement. The titular Cletus was a disgusting old hick who wanted to teach the viewer how to make real moonshine. This one was hard to watch because it was recorded off a handheld camcorder. The guy filming was terrible at keeping the camera steady, so it was hard to make out what was happening. Something about a party and harvesting ingredients. I had to turn it off midway through because the camera work was so bad I started to get sick. That, and someone in the background started moaning for help. One nature special followed a camera which was being lowered into the ocean. The camera must have been pressurized somehow because it went deeper and deeper without cracking or having an issue with transmitting video. Eventually, the camera got so deep there was no light at all. It was silent for a few minutes, then something in the dark groaned. Weird sounds reverberated through the water, almost like chanting. Before I could figure out what it was saying, the camera jerked hard, and the footage cut out. There was one untitled show that started out in a dark room full of shiny threads. A soft voice in the darkness started talking, saying stuff about how kind it was of us to come into its home or whatever. The topic turned to tonight's dinner, and I realized something was slowly creeping towards the camera out of the darkness. The voice was so hypnotic, I didn't realize the thing was a giant spider until its face loomed out of the shadows. Multiple eyes glittered menacingly as the spider clicked its mandibles and reared back. I ripped off my headphones, dove for the remote, and turned the show off before the spider had a chance to do whatever it was planning to do to the cameraman. I was already an arachnophobe, but that show made it so much worse. The way those eyes glistened in the dark. A show that only aired once looked like home video footage of a guy walking through a house. The viewer never saw the guy's face or got an explanation about why he was there. Halfway through the show, the cameraman started filming people sleeping in beds. The creepy thing was the cameraman didn't do anything to them or say anything. He just stood there for a bit and moved on. The show ended when the cameraman crept into the basement and zoomed in on someone watching a TV. The guy turned around and the show abruptly stopped. I couldn't get a good look at the guy's face, but he seemed scared. Even with the threat of potential nightmares hovering over my head, I couldn't stop watching Crossing Hour. Problem was, I couldn't talk to anyone about it. If I told my parents, they'd know I was staying up too late, and the kids at school thought I was making it up for attention. I felt bad about it at first, but then I decided to think about it like I'd been inducted into a secret club. It was a fun feeling, and it took my mind off recent events. And then one day, I stopped watching, all because of one specific show that really got to me. It started out as a pretty great night. Heckbusters had a David episode, and there'd been a particularly kick-ass episode of Raguel. He'd been forced to fight a whole gauntlet of monsters at the same time, and he still won. He even managed to decapitate the monster that had originized the whole thing. Seriously, best show ever. After Raguel's end credits ran, Reagan said goodnight and switched the show over to the Black Room. I was just about to turn it off when a little voice in the back of my head told me to stick around. I had just turned 9 the day before, and I guess that made me feel more grown up or something. So what if the Black Room had given me nightmares before? The White Room had too. It was just weird TV. I could handle it. I settled in and watched the first program. Another episode of Stolas, nothing special. After Stolas ended, a bumper played like usual, but instead of Reagan's normal introduction, the bumper faded in on an empty, black room. Off-screen, Reagan was arguing with someone. Whoever it was, his ass was getting chewed out. This was new. I'd never heard Reagan get angry before. After a few more seconds of arguing, someone pointed out they were on. Reagan stepped into view, fixed her outfit, and glared at the camera. She forced a smile, but I could tell she was still mad. Hey there, creeps. This next program is going to be even spookier than usual. Viewer discretion is advised. Reagan held the smile for a moment, then her face fell. I know I say that every night, but I'm serious. Kids, if you're still here, turn off the TV. Now. Naturally, Reagan's pleading had the opposite effect. The Black Room was disturbing as a rule. If Reagan was begging viewers to switch off, something crazy was about to happen. Turning the TV off wasn't an option. I had to see this for myself. As for the rest of you sickos, let's start the show. But have your remotes ready, just in case. And if it talks to you directly, don't. Reagan's face flickered out, replaced by static. After a few seconds, a title card appeared. Nothing fancy, just some white text on a black background. The name of the program was Invitation. The screen cut to a dimly lit room filled with candles and weird symbols. It was too dark to see exactly what the symbols were, but they were all made up of circles and complicated line work. The audio was bad too, like something recorded on an old home video camera. A hooded man walked into the room, cleared his throat, and spoke to the camera. Deep shadows made it impossible to see his face. Welcome. Tonight, we are going to invite a being from beyond the grave into our earthly plane. Unlike this network's previous offerings, we will be seeing raw, uncontrolled evil on live television. I look forward to the results. The man drew a circle around himself, sat down, and began muttering. I tried to catch the words, but I couldn't understand what he was saying over the camera buzz. The man muttered for a few minutes, then raised his hands. "Hark! If any being hears me, speak! Speak, and be known!" Nothing happened. I laughed. All that build-up for nothing. The man shouted again, trying to get a response. Still nothing. He stood and raged. "Damned spirits! I demand you listen to—" The man screamed. I looked at his feet and noticed in his haste he'd stepped slightly out of the circle. Every inch of flesh outside the circle had been crushed flat. The man barely registered what had happened to him before his foot began moving further out of the circle. He tried to pull it back, but something was preventing him. He screamed in pain as whatever held him slowly dragged him out of safety. Seemingly prepared for this, the man pulled a knife out of his robes and prepared to sever his leg. Before he could swing the blade, the thing grabbing him yanked hard on his leg. The man yelped and fell to the ground, now more than halfway out of the circle. The knife had fallen out of his reach. The invisible creature resumed slowly pulling the man out of his protective charm. "No, I'm sorry," the man screamed as he attempted to claw his way back to safety. "I spoke out of turn. I am a loyal servant. I am your beloved servant." By this point, the man was completely outside the protective boundary. His hood had fallen off, revealing several tattoos on his face. He looked scared. Whatever was in the room with him forced him to stand. He tried to run back to the circle, but the invisible creature pushed him away. I leaned into the TV, absorbed by what I was seeing. The man stood there. For a moment, nothing happened. Tears ran from his eyes as he looked around for any sign of his tormentor. I'll make a sacrifice. Anything you want. Just don't." That was when his body crumpled like a tin can. I recoiled back in shock. 1 second, the guy was fine. The next, his body was flattened in the middle. Blood trickled from his mouth as he gasped his last breath. I like to think he died before the pain hit. The corpse stood there for a few seconds before falling to the ground. After that, nothing. The body stayed on the floor. The thing in the room was silent. The camera buzz droned on and on. Eyes still glued to the TV. I reached for the remote. Whatever came next wasn't worth it. That was when the voice said, "Don't touch that." I froze. Nothing had happened on the show. Same dead guy, same vacant audio buzz, but I'd heard it crystal clear through the headphones. Whatever was in that room was talking. "Good. Hands in your lap. Now I want to talk to you." I did as the voice told. It seemed like a bad idea, but I couldn't help being curious about what it had to say. Listen to me very carefully. This man was a very bad person. He did many terrible things. He deserved to die. Do you understand? I couldn't help nodding. To this day, I'm not sure if it was because I agreed or because I was too scared to argue. Good. With that out of the way, hello, my newly devoted followers. So lovely to meet all of you. A light static haze covered the screen. If I squinted, the static just barely made a shape in the middle of the room. It was vaguely humanoid, but something about it wasn't right. The arms would be too long, then they'd fix themselves, but the head had horns. Then the horns would disappear, but it would have too many legs, and so on. Devoted, you've tuned in tonight because you wanted to see evil. Here I am. Am I what you hoped for? There was a pause. The voice laughed, and the fuzzy shape paced the room. I noticed it steered clear of what remained of the circle. Devoted. Can I be honest with you? I'm thrilled. I've never been able to talk to so many of you at once before. I don't know what to say. Oh, I know. Would anyone like to make a deal? The shape briefly looked at the camera, then continued to pace the room. I was starting to feel let down. The guy getting killed was scary, but this part was dragging on too long. Oh, we've got our first one signed and dotted. Devoted, you're too kind to me. Anyone else? This continued for a while. The shape would pace the room, glance at the camera, say something about completing another deal, then start pacing again. As the program went on, the static shape grew clearer. It got to the point where I didn't have to squint to see it anymore. Devoted, you're all so wonderful. I could deal with you all day. I can't help noticing there are some viewers out there who haven't spoken up yet. Isn't there something you want? The comment got me thinking about home. The show was getting boring, so it wasn't long before I started daydreaming. It would be nice to go back home, see all the friends I had to leave behind, hang out at all my favorite spots again. I could tell all my friends about Crossing Hour too. They'd believe me. We could all have a sleepover and watch it together. I could be the cool kid, the kid everybody liked. It's yours, David. All you have to do is ask. I jumped back to attention. The thing was still pacing the room. It had grown much clearer since I'd zoned out. It was easier to see the transformations as it changed shape. Spider legs, bat wings, eyes with too many pupils, misshapen hands, serpent-like tails, goat heads, and all sorts of other horrors flashed over the thing's frame in impossible, lifelike detail. Just looking at it made me feel sick. You can have anything you want, Devoted. Just ask out loud right now. There was an unnerving forcefulness to the thing's voice. I forced a chuckle and grabbed the remote again. Ask. I winced and ripped my headphones off. The voice was so loud my ears started ringing. I quickly turned off the TV. As the power cut out, I heard a roar of frustration bellow out of the headphones. I can't be sure, but I swear the shape glared at me right before the screen went black. I settled into bed and stared at the ceiling. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get to sleep. I kept replaying the last part of the show in my mind. David and Devoted did sound kind of similar, but Devoted had an extra syllable. But if you said it fast enough, it all sort of ran together, and it was late. I was tired, but I heard David. I fell asleep before I could decide one way or the other. That night I had some of the worst nightmares of my life. Something was in my room and it wanted to hurt me, but I couldn't see it. It kept moving around so I couldn't get a good look at it, and it whispered things about what it would do to me and my parents just when I was starting to calm down. I woke up so many times, I lost track of what was a dream and what was real. At one point, I woke up to a woman sitting on my bed, but she shushed me before I could say anything. Just me, hun. Go back to sleep. In my sleep-numbed state, I reasoned she was either my mom or a dream. Neither one was a threat, so I shut my eyes and drifted off. The rest of the night was peaceful. The following nights, however, were plagued with similar nightmares. None of them were as vivid as the first nights, but they were just as terrifying. It got so bad I couldn't even watch the White Room shows anymore. Eventually, fear became aversion, and aversion became habit. When my family moved out of the apartment and settled into our new house, there were no complaints when my folks said I couldn't keep the TV in my room anymore. All desire to watch Crossing Hour was gone. I didn't think about Crossing Hour again until a few years later. One day, bored in science class, I doodled Raguel in my notebook margins. The doodle activated all the good memories from before invitation, and I decided as long as I stuck to the White Room, it couldn't hurt to check in on Reagan and see how the block was doing. That Saturday night, at 11 o'clock, I snuck downstairs to the basement, plugged in the old 9-inch set, and flipped through every channel, hoping against hope that I'd stumble onto Crossing Hour again. I tried every channel twice. It wasn't playing on any of them. Every couple of weeks I tried again. No luck. Maybe it was a regional thing. Maybe it got canceled. Maybe Reagan just got sick of it, and shut it down. Whatever the reason, Crossing Hour was off the air. Which brings me to this post. A cooking show came on last night, and it reminded me of that damn rat. Normally, I click the show off and try to forget, but this time got me thinking. Has anyone else seen Crossing Hour? If you have, shoot me a message and we can chat about old times. Even better, let me know if you have tapes. I'd love to watch Raguel again. Keep invitation to yourself, though. I don't care if it was a trick, or if it's not as scary as I remember, or if I was hearing things at the end. I never want to see it again.